Welcome back to my series, Rooted in Rome, where I'm giving you the cultural, historical, and political context that's been taken out of the Christianity story. Now, this is part 2 of episode 9. So if you haven't seen the first part of episode 9, go back and watch it because I'm going to jump right back in. So now we're going to talk about the church's role in indigenous genocide, okay? Now, some people will say, the church didn't kill him. Disease did. The conquistadors did. Well, let's be clear about the church's role. Number 1, the church provided the legal justification. Remember the papal bulls, the Dum Diversas, the Romanus Pontifex, Inter Caetera? Those gave Spain and Portugal legal and moral authority to conquer indigenous lands and subjugate indigenous peoples. Without those documents, European monarchs would have had a much harder time justifying mass conquest, so the church made it holy. Number 2, the church blessed the conquistadors. Priests traveled with Spanish and Portuguese expeditions. They held mass before battles. They blessed the soldiers. They said, God is with you. Number 3, the church administered the encomienda system. Catholic priests and bishops were granted indigenous people to exploit, and Catholic missions forced indigenous people into labor. The Jesuit reductions in South America are often romanticized as protecting indigenous people, but they were labor camps, and indigenous people were forced into these missions, forced to convert, forced to abandon their languages and cultures, and forced to work. Yes, they were sometimes protected from the worst abuses of Spanish colonizers, but they were still not free. They were still controlled. Number 4, the church forcibly converted indigenous people. The papal bulls explicitly commanded conversion. Indigenous people were given a choice. You either convert to Christianity and submit to Spanish rule, or you refuse and be legally subject to warfare, enslavement, and death. So many converted under threat of violence. And when they converted, the church took that as justification for the entire system. They're like, look, we're saving souls. We're bringing them to Christ. Yes, many are dying, but at least they're dying Christian. Number 5, the church destroyed indigenous cultures. Catholic priests burned indigenous books, destroyed temples, banned languages, and erased spiritual practices. An example is the Maya codices. The Maya had a sophisticated writing system and thousands of books containing their history, astronomy, mathematics, and religion. Spanish priests burned almost all of them, and only 4 Maya codices survive today. Bishop Diego de Landa wrote, "We found a large number of books, and as they contained nothing in which were not to be seen as superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all." Centuries of knowledge gone, because a Catholic bishop decided it was superstition. So let me show you how the church thought about indigenous people. In 1550, Spain held a formal debate in Valladolid to answer the question, are indigenous people fully human? Do they have souls? And is it moral to enslave them? Think about it, y'all. In 1550, millions of indigenous people were already dead, okay? And Spain was still debating whether or not they were human. There was two sides to this debate. You have Juan Gines de Sepulveda. He was a Spanish philosopher. Now, he argued that indigenous people were naturally slaves, using Aristotle's philosophy. He said they're barbarians who practice human sacrifice and cannibalism. He claimed it morally justified to wage war against them and enslave them, and said that Spanish conquest is good because it brings them civilization and Christianity. So then we have Bartolomé de las Casas. He is the Dominican friar. Now, he argued that indigenous people are fully human and have rational souls, said the conquest is evil and unjust, and documented the atrocities he witnessed and called for an end to the encomienda system. The outcome is that the church never issued a definitive ruling. Spain declared that indigenous people should not be enslaved, in theory, but in practice, the encomienda system continued. The exploitation continued, the death continued, because even though the church said indigenous people had souls, they still allowed the systems that were killing them to operate. In 1550, 58 years after Columbus, the church was still debating whether indigenous people were fully human. And while that debate was happening, indigenous people were dying by the millions, and the church did nothing to stop it. So here's the thing. Spain and Portugal didn't come to the Americas just to spread Christianity. We know that, right? They came to get rich. They wanted gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, land, and they needed labor to extract those resources. So at first, they used indigenous people, but indigenous people were dying. Disease, forced labor, massacres, starvation. The population was collapsing. So by the mid 1500s, there weren't enough indigenous people left to sustain the colonial economy. So European colonizers needed a new source of labor, and they already had papal permission to enslave Africans. Remember, the papal bulls gave them this permission, and by the time indigenous populations were collapsing in the Americas, Portugal had already been enslaving Africans for decades. So Spain and Portugal turned to the transatlantic slave trade. So let me break down how the system operated. Okay, so step 1, capture in Africa. European traders, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, French, established forts and trading posts along the West African coast. They didn't usually capture Africans themselves. Instead, they traded with African kingdoms and warlords who captured people from rival groups. The ways in which Africans were captured is through warfare between kingdoms. So prisoners of war sold to Europeans. There were kidnapping raids, which were armed groups attacking villages. There was judicial punishment. Some African leaders sold criminals or debtors. And there was betrayal. People tricked or sold by those that they trusted. These captives were brought to the coast and sold to European traders. Step 2 is the slave castles. Now, we talked about this in the last episode. Captured Africans were held in slave castles, fortresses like the Elmina Castle and Cape Coast Castle. They were held in dungeons, packed in dark, filthy cells, chained, barely fed. Many died before they even reached the ships. And above those dungeons, Catholic priests held mass. Step 3 is the Middle Passage. Once enough captives were gathered, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. This voyage is called the Middle Passage. Conditions on the ships is that enslaved Africans were packed onto the hold, lying down, chained together, and barely able to move. They were given minimal food and water. There was no sanitation. People had to urinate and defecate where they lay. Disease spread rapidly. There was smallpox, scurvy, dysentery. Many died and their bodies were thrown overboard. Some jumped overboard to escape, choosing death over enslavement. The voyage took 6 to 12 weeks, depending on conditions. The mortality rate was 10 to 20% of enslaved Africans that died during the Middle Passage. That means for every 10 people who boarded the ship, 1 to 2 died before reaching the Americas. Step 4, the arrival and sale. When the ships arrived in the Americas, enslaved Africans were sold at auction. They were inspected like livestock, stripped naked and examined, sold to the highest bidder, and branded with their owner's mark. Families were separated. Husbands from wives, parents from children, on purpose. Enslavers knew that breaking family bonds made people easier to control. Step 5, life on plantations. Enslaved Africans were forced to work on sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil, which were the most brutal. There were tobacco plantations in Virginia and Maryland, rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, cotton plantations in the southern U.S., especially after the cotton gin was invented in 1793. There was also coffee plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean, and silver mines in Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia. They worked from sunrise to sunset. They were whipped, beaten, raped, and killed. They were given minimal food and housing. And the average lifespan of an enslaved person on a Caribbean sugar plantation was 7 years after arrival. 7 years. They were worked to death and replaced. So now let's talk about the numbers, the scale of the transatlantic slave trade, okay? Total Africans enslaved and transported from the 1500s through the 1800s is 12 to 15 million Africans, okay? But that's just the ones who survived the journey. An estimated 2 to 3 million died during the Middle Passage, and millions more died during capture, the march to the coast, and while held in slave castles. So, the total number of Africans killed or enslaved because of the transatlantic slave trade is estimated to be at 20 to 30 million people. I am running out of time, so when we come back, I'm going to tell you where they were taken and to what countries, okay? So just stay tuned, y'all, and I will upload part 3 as soon as possible.